I know what most of you guys are thinking. This guy probably sniffed a Sharpie earlier and killed the last few brain cells inside of his head. I mean, not that he had many brain cells left beforehand, but he definitely doesn't have any left after the Sharpie incident. And let's be brutally honest about Sharpies. They kind of sneak up on you. Like, you may just start seeing floating unicorns in your office only to realize that you probably need to crack a window open because you've been working with the Sharpie. But there's no judgment here. I realize that we have all been high on Sharpies at least at one point in our lives. It's kind of unavoidable. And look, I'll be brutally honest, I probably will change the title to this video because I'm not sure if this is technically the best horror movie of all time, but I guess it may be the best horror movie of all time. At least it's in my top 10 for sure. I know the critics overall basically destroyed the film, and I'll be brutally honest about myself in this situation. I know when the Paranormal Activity franchise started up, I remember just being like this snotty little teenager that thought that he knew everything about films. I mostly spend my time watching like low budget indie films and thinking they were the greatest thing of all time. And I missed out on a lot of these like heavy blockbusters or these big franchise films because I had like these preconceived notions about them not being very good because I based my entire life on Rotten Tomatoes and whatever other reviewing website is out there. But I recently went back and watched a lot of these and I realized how wrong I was. I do believe Paranormal Activity is definitely one of the better horror franchises out there. And not to say that they're all great. I definitely enjoyed number 1, number 2, and the one that we're about to dissect here in just a couple of minutes, the Next of Kin Paranormal Activity film. As I mentioned, back then I really thought that I knew everything, but now going back, I definitely regret now watching this in the theaters. I definitely feel like it's a film that would have been a different experience. Sitting in an itchy seat where a bunch of ass cheeks have sat and just walking around the stickiest floors on planet Earth, but I definitely think that it would have been worth it. Now, I might make a separate video where I talk about the entire franchise as a whole, but today we're only going to focus on Next of Kin, which I mentioned was unfairly criticized for some unknown reason. It's funny to me, we look at a lot of these like original classics from the 80s and 90s and they fall into some similar tropes that we see modern day horror films, but unfortunately because they're modern, I don't think they can get away with some of these things. But overall, as I mentioned, it's one of my favorite horror films. It has great pacing, it develops the characters extremely well, great writing, interesting dialogue. There's some comedy spread around the entirety of the film, mostly in the first half of the film because, you know, obviously it's a horror film. Once everything starts to unravel, it seems like comedy has no place. I will say that's probably the only downside to the film. Once the horror really hits hard, they forget about all of the other things that made the film just one of the best out there. They stop with the character developing, they stop with the great dialogue, and they fall into, as I mentioned, some of the cliches when it comes down to horror films. And that might be, like I said, one of the only downsides to the film. But the film has enough mysteries and it has enough intrigue to keep you engaged for, I would say, like 90% of the film. There are some instances here and there where, like I said, it falls into some of the cliches for horror films. Now, the story is pretty straightforward. The main character is trying to figure out a little bit about her past and her family since she's never met her biological family. And so she kind of explores a little bit of her mother's past. And this leads her into this tiny little village, which is supposed to be an Amish little town. The truth is eventually unraveled, but there's always a little bit of mystery around every single corner. Characters are also very three-dimensional, so you can connect with them regardless of what your background is. They're just very down to earth. They're very well written, and they progress extremely well throughout the entirety of the film. Even when a character is technically there for comedic relief, you still connect with him on a deeper level, and you definitely root for him to survive. The acting performances were also superb. You had Emily Bader as the main character here, Roland Bug, who's her significant other in the film. Overall, I have to say the film is incredibly well paced, great writing, great dialogue, great character development. You really care about every single one of the characters involved. There's a lot of mystery and intrigue around every single corner, and that will definitely keep you hooked. And I just want to clarify, I do love a lot of the original horror films from back in the day. I grew up watching The Shining, the entire Alien franchise. I love The Thing. I'm a huge fan of George A. Romero as well, but I just feel like there was something special and unique about this particular film, especially towards the end. They've built everything up, they've built the characters, the story, the plot, but then the ending is just incredibly nail-biting. I don't want to give anything away, but it's definitely gut-wrenching. And I almost challenge you to watch this without puckering up your butt cheeks, because it's nearly impossible. It's also worth mentioning that this film doesn't really have any connections or any attachments to the rest of the Paranormal franchise. This was almost kind of like a soft reboot. There were moments where I thought maybe this was kind of like a prequel to the original Paranormal franchise, but that's definitely not the case. I guess you could in your mind make the connection, but as I said, it's kind of like a soft reboot. It's giving us a different take, or taking a completely different direction, which, as I said, I really did enjoy. And honestly, there are moments where I feel like the fact that it had that name attached to it, and the fact that people kind of correlated this film to the Paranormal Activity franchise as a whole, I think it not only made people a little bit more critical of the film, but also a lot of big giant horror fans, the people that might have given this film a second opportunity or a second glance or a second chance, those people probably skipped on it, just like myself, just because it had that Paranormal Activity name attached to it. So maybe if it had just had its own universe, or if it was its own film franchise, maybe more people would have flocked to the theaters. And I don't think that the rating overall online would be as low as it is. If you haven't watched any of the other paranormal films in the franchise up to this point, there's no real need to go back and rewatch them, although, as I said at the beginning, I do think that Paranormal Activity number 1 and 2 were worth a watch, but you don't have to go back there and experience or to fill in any gaps. This is a standalone film. It's a self-contained movie. Now, let me reiterate this. It probably isn't the best horror movie of all time, but I definitely feel like it's up there. It challenges its predecessors and some of the all-time greats. It's a shame that a lot of people are misguided by a lot of these quote-unquote professional critics. It feels like a lot of them just kind of banded together and just decided that this film wasn't very good. But as I've been saying for the last couple of years, I think it's very important in today's film landscape to really make up your own mind when it comes down to films, because I've seen a lot of these that got heavily criticized or panned. Venom is a perfect example of that. Morbius is another perfect example. Those movies are not great and they're not perfect, but they definitely don't deserve the ratings that they got. They're decent, they're watchable. I actually enjoyed both of them very much, even though I know they're flawed and they're films that I'm not gonna watch consistently throughout my life. They're solid films, they're enjoyable, and I definitely don't believe that they deserved the insane amount of backlash that they got. But again, just my personal opinion, my personal take on the horror universe as a whole. But yes, I'm not ashamed to admit this in public. I absolutely loved Next of Kin. I think it's a brilliant horror film, and I definitely feel like if you haven't watched it, it's worth giving a shot. And if you've already watched it, maybe it's worth giving a second look and to fully appreciate the film. But let me know down in the comment section what your take on the entire Paranormal Activity franchise is, or what you thought about this particular entry into the franchise. I'm very curious to see what you guys have to say, or what other horror films did you guys really enjoy that maybe the crowds didn't. But regardless, thank you guys so much for tuning in. Hit the like button, subscribe if you guys enjoy this type of content. Stay safe, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you.